Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for API Academy's Q2 2022 Tech Talk. We definitely appreciate you coming on board. And for those of you who are watching this on via API Academy, this obviously will be posted later on today or early tomorrow morning as a resource for everybody involved. Before I get totally started on today's topic, what I wanted to do is briefly revisit API Academy in general for those of you who aren't totally familiar with it. We literally wrote the books on best practices for API design, strategy, and security, as well as microservices. These are available on API Academy. We do encourage you to take a look. Again, take a look around API Academy in general. It's the industry resource for all things related to design, strategy, and security of APIs. So with that, let me go ahead and get started on today's focus, which is API security in a new world. So we're all aware that APIs have become a pretty substantial attack vector these days. Pretty understandable. According to Akamai, API traffic is about 90% of all web traffic, which is staggering, with 53% of all attacks focused on them. And Gartner actually agrees, stating that API abuse is the top attack vector. The boom in mobile apps requires web-based APIs as on the back end. It guarantees this is going to do nothing but grow. So enterprises obviously have an issue with this because nobody wants to be on the front page of the paper because of a data leakage, or even worse, financial data loss. So today, what we're going to do is discuss the incredible arsenal of brainpower here today is API security. What can enterprises do to protect themselves and their customers, not only from an API management perspective, but also enterprise-wide security tactics, and we'll discuss emergency threat vectors toward the end. So with that, let me introduce our panel today. So briefly starting with me, I head up API Academy as well as head up product marketing for API management at Broadcom. I have about 15 years, closer to 20 these days, of experience in security and mobility marketing. And I handle messaging, positioning, evangelism of absolutely hands down the best API management solution on the market today. Prior to Broadcom, I had product and solutions marketing positions at Blue Coat Systems, a web security company with real-time defense against malware and web-based threats, and now a component of the semantic division at Broadcom. And on weekends, I'm almost certainly going to be riding with my Harley Club or teaching people how to teach people how to blow bubbles underwater. Next, we'll go with Francois. He was the first developer at Layer 7 Technologies and has had numerous roles in the years that followed. Along the way, Francois collaborated across teams on important innovations such as the OAuth toolkit and other API security-related capabilities that are mission critical to many enterprises today. Francois was also field CTO at Ping Identity, where he advanced identity-focused API security capabilities, as well as the chief architect for Amplify, Axway's API management solution. Next on the board is Aaron. He came into the API space through the integration space and has been working with APIs for well over 15 years. An original Layer 7 employee, Aaron's been helping customers in pre-sales and adoption roles, ensuring that APIs are deployed, secured, and integrated to help those customers. Aaron lives in Colorado and skis with his family in the winter, which I think this year pretty much ends in July, and rides bikes during the summer. And then we have Matt over at Noname Security. He's formerly an OWASP global board member and has 14 plus years of OWASP project leadership, as well as he's a distinguished engineer at Noname Security. When not writing automation code in Geo, Matt is pushing for DevSecOps everywhere by contributing to open source projects, presenting, training, and continuing to co-opt new technologies. He's also an adjunct professor for the University of Texas Computer Science Department, teaching the next generation of computer science students about application security. His work has included security consulting, pen testing, threat modeling, code reviews, training, and teaching at UT and Texas A&M University. He holds 2 degrees from Texas A&M and several security and Linux certifications. And we'll wrap up, last but not least, with Carl. He's a cybersecurity leader and innovator who serves as the CISO for Noname Security with over 25 years experience leading innovative and diverse teams of technology and security professionals in financial services, retail, and Fed. Previously, Carl worked as the CISO for PennyMac Financial Services and City National Bank, and he has a track record of providing CEOs, CTOs, and investors in cybersecurity strategies for product, market, and customer success. And with all that said, let's get started with our panel discussion. So Matt, let's start with you. What are the problems around API security that are causing issues, and how can we mitigate those? Matt, you're on mute if you're on. Well, while we're waiting for Matt, let's. Oh, go ahead. How about let's move over to Carl. Carl, do you want to take that on while we wait for Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. So Matt and I, both work with Noname, and we work with a lot of our customers in the same way, which is really getting to understand that each company and each environment does have sort of different challenges. So APIs are sort of inherently custom development, and so security teams are having, broadly speaking, are having challenges sort of staying at pace with the developers who are really leaning into APIs as a core of microservices applications. And so the first primary challenge that we're seeing is that security teams are behind the curve, oftentimes seeing APIs moving into production that have not been configuration checked or vulnerability tested prior to production. And so that puts the security teams at a big disadvantage. And so the reality is a lot of APIs right now are low-hanging fruit for attackers. And so security teams are sometimes, unfortunately, becoming aware of those attack surface problems after it's too late. And so that conversation with the security teams that we're having, it really starts with just getting caught up, getting trued up to what inventory is sort of out there, and help giving them the tools to see and feel everything in the environment, so at least they can see where they are on the chessboard.
It's your turn to be on mute.
It helps if I'm off mute. That was directed toward Francois. You've been in this space for a while, and I'm going to follow that up with Aaron, since you've been in the field so much. What else are you seeing relating to API security issues in general in the field, and what customers are doing to mitigate those?
Yeah, I think as security, API security can be very complicated for some of our customers. There is some complex integration that is required if you're thinking about, the portion of security that's relating to, creating the experience that you're looking for in terms of how the user gets authenticated and things like that, right? So in order to make it easy for the user and still be secure, you need to do a lot of integration, and that can be really complicated in a very large enterprise where there's lots of different systems that are potentially getting involved in providing information you need for those types of handshakes. So yeah, that's definitely one of the challenges. API security, I think that the reason that things like solutions like Noname exist is because a lot of times you can't make sure that something doesn't fall through the cracks, right? So we do a lot of runtime security enforcement that are based on things like tokens, right? But secrets leakage is just a reality that we have to deal with. So we need secondary types of checks and balances, and we need to have a balance between traditional real-time API security, but also out-of-band analysis and looking for things. Assume you're getting hacked and go out and look for it. And Bill, you go back on mute, it looks like.
Yeah, sorry about that. I have a tendency to do that. How about you, Aaron?
Yeah, I think Francois touched on a number of the points there. I think things are complicated, right? I mean, just that phrase, we rely on a token or we get a token. Well, getting a token for OAuth or OpenID is not easy, and there are so many places where developers and organizations can introduce their own issues by doing those things. So I think that's a really big part of it, making sure that standards are not just done, but they're done correctly and well and secure. And I think the original driver for APIs, your stat of 90% of traffic now is API driven, I think is kind of amazing. But, the original driver, the original spike in the market that Francois and I probably saw when we started working together 10 years ago was around mobile. I think now the mobile API space is still very 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 apt. It's very there still, but now we're looking at cloud and people putting things on private, public cloud, mixing the two. I think the security just becomes more complex in that environment. So I think, yeah, all those complexities, all those things that can go wrong, low-hanging fruit, APIs are definitely there, and we've seen a number of attacks like that. So, yeah.
And Matt, now that your audio is working, do you want to chime in on any last thoughts on what you're seeing with API security, what's causing the issues, and how to mitigate?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that weird audio bit. So I'm not sure what was said before, but one thing that caught me is that we're pushing developers to move faster and faster all the time, and the other side of it is that developers are using frameworks to help them move faster and faster all the time. Things that do auto binding, right? So I send you a JSON, you automatically take that in and turn it into a data model and dump that into the database, right? Well, that gets me my mass assignment, right? That same feature that makes your developers go faster also introduces a vulnerability if I don't do it quite right. And so there's a lot of different patterns you have to work with as a developer to not only go fast, but go fast and implement things in a correct fashion.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to jump over to gateways, something near and dear to a few of us. Francois, you've been around, or you've been involved with API security going back to really when they weren't even called APIs yet, or there were various derivatives of APIs. From your perspective, what's the role of API gateways in securing APIs, and how is that changing?
So a lot of things are not changing, and obviously there is change as well. But if you think about what API gateways are good for, have been, and continue to be good used for today in terms of API security, the whole access control enforcement, especially coarse-grained access control, often is delegated to a gateway that allows enterprises to delegate access control out of the backend application into the infrastructure to a certain limit, right? Input sanitization is huge, right? A lot of what we're talking about today is very, threat protection. So the thing with API gateways, that have a lot of context, right? They can look and apply specific JSON structures, schemas, and validate things like, this input parameter is a string and it's only for alphanumerical characters, right? Things that, or this is only can potentially have value red, yellow, and green, right? Those are things that make it impossible to inject things like a SQL injection and things like that, right? So it's a good complementary security precaution. API gateways, rate limiting has always been a big one, right? And that has some security implications. It's one form of protection. A very big general category is security integration that I was talking about earlier in the introduction, right? The gateways are a great place to plug in together all the little bits and systems that you need to create that experience and get the right, claims that you need for consuming the API. But, that stuff's been around forever. What's changing, is that, as I was saying in the intro, right? You can still apply the current access control to a new type of APIs like GraphQL, right? That works really well. And some things are not relevant anymore, right? 15 years ago, we spent a lot of time focusing on message level security, and that's totally out of fashion now, and people are not necessarily applying security like that. But real-time versus out-of-band analysis that I was talking about, and things that Noname has great solutions for. I don't want to dive into zero trust maybe at this point, but we need to go beyond real-time security, and that's what's changing.
On the Noname side, anything to add to that? I know you guys work with gateways pretty extensively.
Well, I think one nice thing about having one nice thing about having an API gateway in place with the security device or program or platform, what have you, right, is that if you have an integration between those two, some of the heavy lifting that the API gateway can do in terms of a security context can be done by the platform. So if I, as the security platform notice something wonky about a particular request, I can ask the gateway to de-auth that JWT token and basically knock that person off from talking to the API anymore, right? So those kind of, and I also think of APIs, honestly, it's almost like back in the day when you wouldn't think of putting a computer on the internet without a firewall in front of it. I don't think it's all that prudent to put an API on the internet without a gateway in front of it, because you get all these benefits of sort of basic blocking and tackling that the API gateway can give you, and then layer that with some additional security platform, and you've got a pretty rugged setup.
It sounded like, Carl, you wanted to add on something there?
No, Matt's spot on. I mean, first and foremost, we're a unapologetically pro API gateway. Like we're not in the API security business to suggest the gateway is anything other than exactly the place and time where a good majority of API security controls are best employed. And that's why we think that what we can do with a gateway integration is to reinforce it and help it become better at being the gateway that we all want it to be. That's why we invest in gateways. They're exactly where we want a lot of the security controls actually applied in real time.
Got it. So actually extending along those lines, this actually staggered me quite a bit, and I'm fairly familiar with the organization. One web security consortium that's been around for 20 years, I thought it was around 10, but 20 years, is the Open Web Application Security Project, also known as OWASP. And this is an incredible resource for any enterprise focusing on top 10 web-based threats. And it's regularly updated. That's what's really cool about it. It's not a one and done. Lately, they've really zeroed in on API security. And in fact, a couple of years ago, felt that API security was such an attack vector that they created, in addition to the OWASP top 10, the OWASP API security top 10 as a companion piece. So Matt, as a longtime member of the OWASP community, what are your thoughts on both of the top 10s? And from your perspective, how can enterprises best utilize these resources?
Yeah, well, and yeah, the OWASP has been around longer than anyone can remember, honestly, and I've been around there probably too long, maybe, but I enjoy it, so it works for me. The big thing with the changes over the years for both the traditional, what I would call the traditional top 10 and the API top 10, which hasn't been around as long, is that the focus of them have changed from being highly specific. If you look at the 2007 OWASP top 10, it enumerated very specific vulnerabilities. And if you look at the categories today, they're much broader. So I think they're much more applicable, because it used to be if you handled the top 10 in 2007, you might have knocked out 7 vulnerability cases, but not larger risks. And they've sort of shifted into a risk-based model. And the other aspect, besides just being updated frequently, is they're vendor neutral, right? This is a whole bunch of security professionals who are in the field, who get together and come to consensus about these are the really important things. The interesting thing between the traditional top 10 and the API top 10 is there's a fair amount of overlap, but honestly, if you have a SDLC or program focused on handling the top 10 traditional and you have APIs, you've got some gaps. There are several things that only exist in the API top 10, so you really have to take those both into account. Injection, like as an example, is in both, but things like mass assignment is really only specific to APIs. It doesn't make sense in a web application world. So I think you really have to use them both in tandem, and because of their broader reach in terms of risk as opposed to being highly specific, if you can cover the top 10, you're doing pretty good. But I did a talk at an OWASP conference last fall, I guess, actually, I should say, about watch out for OWASP number 11, right? It's called the top 10 because there's more than 10. So I think a lot of people say, hey, I've done the top 10, I can walk away, I'm done. And that's not really the case. It's good, and it's a pretty good foundational thing, but there's a lot more than just what's in that top 10. Great place to start, not a place to finish.
That's a good point. And I will say, to give a small shout out to API Academy, Francois and I regularly update, regularly being like every 12 to 18 months, API Academy's website with, okay, here's this year's top 10. So what can you do with your gateway to mitigate against the threats based on these top 10? We do it for both the web-based security as well as web-based apps, as well as the API security. So definitely a great resource, as I said before, and as you just pointed out. Francois, since you've been involved with that a little bit, do you want to chime in anything, or?
The OWASP top 10, the reason it's a good list and the reason you should pay attention to it is that, especially the top of the list, is that there are things that happen, right? They're on top of the list for a reason. Those are things that are actually bugs and APIs that are found a lot. And it's helpful for people to look at it just even if just for starting to think about, hey, let's go and look for bugs in our API. What kind of stuff should we be looking for? And I think people sometimes wrongly think that the OWASP top 10 is going to give them a list of like attacks that you can find, right? Like, ooh, I have a detector for an OWASP API sec top 10 number 6. Yeah, it's not so much that. It's more like these are the patterns that you need to make sure that you're not breaking. And yeah, I think it's really helpful in that perspective.
Great, thank you. So I mentioned mobile apps earlier and their rise to prominence, and I think we all carry around some form of mobile device filled with apps. Side note, I was at Blue Coat when the iPad came out, and IT said, no iPhones, no Android, no, especially iPads. And that worked really well until the CEO of Blue Coat at the time basically said to IT, figure it out, I'm using this. And strangely enough, they figured it out. And this was not a one-off. The app stores on the market today are driving this generation of both enterprise and personal computing. So I'm going to start with Aaron on a three-part question, but by all means, I mean, mobile apps are huge, and obviously the security holes that go with them are huge. So please feel free to chime in. But starting with Aaron from an API developer's perspective, how can they protect their enterprise and their actual users from API attack vectors, especially since API developers don't, frankly, give a crap about security? You're on mute, Aaron.
I felt like I had to fit in with the gang, right? If I wasn't on mute at least once, we wouldn't be a gang. So yeah, I think, well, hopefully some API developers do care about security, but yeah, I get that. So I think a lot of what Francois talked about when he talked about gateways is what we're hoping that the API developers, people building their APIs, are worried about. We talked about authorization, authentication, and audit, and those kinds of things. I think they're really important. The threat protection side, I think, is becoming, thankfully, more and more standard. More and more people are thinking about threat protection in the way they used to think about it for a website and a web page. And if that Akamai stat is valid, then the OWASP top 10 for APIs is now more important than the OWASP top 10 for a standard website. So I think all those things are important. One of the things about APIs is as they get more successful, not only do they have more attack vectors, they also have the possibility of running hot and performing badly. And that can be just as important from a security perspective, that the API doesn't run too hot and the backends melt down and open up new aspects. So I think all those things are important. One of the ways we've looked at that is to standardize how those app developers actually access our APIs, right? So things like SDKs and frameworks for calling into my API, do a couple of things. They make it easier for that developer to reach my API, but they give me a level of assurance that they're doing it in the right way, that they're doing, mutual TLS, that they're sending messages in the right format, that the encryption is at the right standard. So, sometimes the API developer can actually help themselves by helping the app developer as well.
Anybody else want to add into that? Okay, well, from the second part of this one, so that was from an API developer perspective, but now let's take a look at the IT perspective. So they've got these API developers, you got app developers utilizing those APIs, but what can IT do to protect their virtual castle, given these incredibly diverse systems and applications now being used on their network?
Yeah, so
open it up.
Yeah, for me or everyone?
That's for everyone.
Okay. Well, I'll jump in first then, Bill. So I think, to start with, having a standard interface that protects those. If the API developer really doesn't care about security, or it's not their main priority, then things like API gateways definitely fit in there. I think the idea of an API being low-hanging fruit is absolutely spot on, but what we're going to see is more and more that it's not one API call that is the attack vector, right? It's 10 API calls constructed in the right way to find a weakness, or maybe as simple as doing API scraping and just pulling all the data down. So I think the gateway becomes an important part in capturing that data, but then other things behind that will add the real value. So seeing the threats of multiple APIs, and maybe not even just API calls, right? Maybe it's the web page and the API call and a backend's behavior that is the threat there. So I think that, to me, that's the area where organizations really need to look now as they get multiple APIs.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of double down on the API gateway thing. The thing for me too with API gateways, if you have 10 different teams making up all of what ends up being your landscape of APIs, and you don't have something like an API gateway, particularly for auth-in and auth-z, you end up with 10 different implementations of those. Same for audit logs, right? I'd rather have one at the gateway and take that sort of development cost off of the developers and centralize it. That's one of the cases where centralization makes a lot of sense. The other issue I've seen with API-driven either mobile apps or web apps, for that matter, is from an IT perspective, particularly the cybersecurity side of IT, is the assumption that if I test dynamically use the mobile app, right, or the web app, I have tested the API. That makes a somewhat bold assumption that the mobile app calls all of the possible API endpoints and in all the possible ways. And that's not necessarily true. So I've seen a lot of enterprises that say, yeah, we're testing our APIs because we have our dynamic scanner for mobile or web, and we're pointing it at the app. And therefore, secondhand order, we are testing the APIs. Well, you are to some degree, but really you don't know what degree that is unless you've done some sort of accounting of, these are all the calls from the app, these are all the calls fielded by the API, right? You can have some big gaps. And this is where a security-specific API product really helps you, right? Because then it can see all those gaps and talk directly to the API. The other interesting thing too is a lot of developers have this. I've seen this for years. It happened in traditional web apps. It's happening now with APIs. The assumption is the only thing that's ever going to call my API is the client, right? Could be the mobile app, could be the SDK, could be the whatever. But as a pen tester, I just need something that speaks HTTP. Right? That could be something as low level as curl or a little bit of coding, right? It doesn't have to be anything that enforces security that you would get out of a traditional client. So I think those are the places where IT can sort of help emphasize the need for a more thorough investigation of the security of APIs rather than just a sort of a secondhand, look, I tested the thing that calls the API, therefore the API is secure. Well, maybe, but we don't really know.
Yeah, I love what you said, Matt, about that. I always tell people, the hacker is not using your app, right? They're stepping outside the boundary of the client and they're really hitting your API directly. And so if you really want to test that security, you also need to jump at that layer. You get basically a lot of blind spots by not doing that. So I think that looking at the blind spots that we know are out there are a good starting point, this being one. And another one being, Bill, in the way that you phrase the question, how are the IT people going to secure API traffic in their networks? Maybe it's not their networks, right? Don't forget about the fact that APIs end up everywhere on clouds and things like that. So even the blind spot of maybe you should do an API inventory across your different systems, and look for the API you don't know exists right now, and maybe start there.
Yeah, that's interesting. That actually ties into the third question of the three-parter. So we talked about API developers and loosely tied to that is app developers. And then we talked about IT trying to protect their domain, and yeah, maybe in today's world be a virtual domain. But how can IT now work with developers to ensure that they have a secure framework for actual built-in testing? Because that's at the top of mind of every CISO out there.
Yeah, For me,
Yeah,
it's being able to test early and often, right? In the CI/CD phase, that's the biggest thing. Like the whole shift left idea, right? The earlier I can get feedback to developers, the better. I've worked at places where I was the tester who found the thing, you know, the Thursday before the Friday launch and made everybody's weekend awful. And nobody likes that situation. That's not a winning situation, and you sure don't make friends and influence people positively if that's your modus operandi. So I think any kind of tooling or testing you do or assessment or what have you, you need to push it as close to when that developer is typing on a keyboard, right? If it's in their IDE, if it's the minute they check in code and you build something in a UAT or a pre-prod environment, like that's where that testing needs to happen, early and often.
Yeah, and I'd add that the majority of organizations are really happy and used to doing functional and performance testing, but security testing that early, I just don't see that as a common thing. So working out how to test an API correctly for security, I think is a massive thing that organizations really need to step up on, because it's often a last minute thing, as Matt said.
Yeah, and one of the gaps that you find is, you know, a lot of the tooling relies on like a Swagger or Open API spec to sort of understand how to talk to the API. But if those aren't well done or are missing areas, you're going to have missing areas of testing, right? There's a wide range of things you can put into an Open API spec beyond just like it takes this, you know, HTTP method at this endpoint, right? You can do validations and a whole bunch of stuff inside of the Open API specs, and very few people do. So the ability of a tool that relies on that to intelligently test your API is reduced if that's not a fully featured, fully spec'd out Open API spec. That's one of the reasons why if you have like a runtime monitoring of your API, you can generate those, and that generated spec can be used to test, right? I've already seen how people talk to that API, therefore I know how to test it already because I've watched it at runtime.
Great, thank you. So let's move away from API management through gateways and mobile and look at the bigger picture. Carl, as CISO at Noname, obviously API security has become a much higher priority risk topic in the industry. Can you talk about any discussions that you see happening at the C-levels of the enterprises you're working with relating to APIs and API security across the board?
I think that there's good news on that front. And the good news is that it's fairly easy to make the case now to a sort of board level or a business unit executive that the APIs, particularly those that we're exposing publicly, those APIs are our products. They are our products and services as a business. They're things that generate revenue now, whether we're exposing data or initiating transactions. So the connective tissue to the business executive is that APIs are revenue streams, and their revenue streams warrant having quality, integrity, security, and when we can really focus that message with the executive team and at the board level that the API is the technical manifestation of that product and service, they really get that. And so I think that organizations are starting to have and are going to continue to have that conversation when they're thinking about these as products and services, but that the API is the enabling sort of technology, and then they can really get behind when we make an investment into API governance, API quality, API security. There's a very tangible connection there to just the quality and the integrity of their products.
That
Anyone else want to
perspective.
chime in there?
Yeah, no, that's a good way to think about it, Carl.
And staying along that track, for companies who are really advanced from your perspective towards strong API security measures, what are they doing right? And conversely, yin and yang effect here, what are the primary blockers security teams are facing when they try to implement new controls for APIs?
Well, we've talked a lot about the some of the moving parts of the API chessboard, gateways, developers, security teams, et cetera. What companies that are doing really well do right is they look at APIs as a life cycle problem. Developers aren't the bad guys. Right? APIs are not the bad guys. These are the good guys, and also what we're seeing in terms of misconfiguration and breaches that actually are successful, a lot of that's not on the developer's shoulders. It really is on the configuration of the network, or it's on the configuration of the gateway. So we're going to do API security well when we wrap our arms around the concept that it's all of us together. It's a security team, it's the gateway team, it's the network team, it's the developers, and it is from the first time the developer puts finger to keyboard all the way through the SOC and NOC operations center, seeing alerts triaged at 2 in the morning. And so the best programs encompass all of those stakeholders, and all of those stakeholders essentially moving towards the same strategic direction. And so I think that, so conversely, where security problems fall, or where security problems really manifest themselves the most, the barriers are when there are pockets of knowledge in an organization. So for example, if a security team doesn't even know that there's a set of APIs that are published, if there's inconsistent knowledge in terms of whether there's sensitive data included in the payload of an API call, or whether or not we've got inconsistent logging and inventory. There's across those controls, the more isolated that there's knowledge and capability in an organization, it creates this organizational change problem. And so organizations really ought to be considering, how do I look at an API footprint and sort of bring under the tent of an API security program, or under an API management program, security stakeholders, governance stakeholders, data protection stakeholders. Those are really important to have sort of all collaborating together. So what we focus on is, of course, I call it the technical enablement of that. So it's the unified visibility of the inventory. It's the unified understanding of context and configuration, that a network team and a developer and a security team can all look at the same sort of characteristics of an API and say, yep, that's the API. That's how it's designed. That's how it talks. That's its traffic load. And so that technical enablement is one thing, but organizations have to also decide that they want to tackle an API footprint as a team effort.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to chime in anything? Okay, well, let's move on to the next one then. So this is starting with Matt. I talk English. I suspect you've seen many attack vectors that bypass what we would consider traditional security measures. Can you describe some of the top ones you've seen and what enterprises can do to help mitigate against those?
Yeah, sure. One of the more interesting ones of late that I've seen is with the cloud providers having WAF or WAF-like offerings. They're doing this at scale, so they have certain limitations that in a lot of cases aren't widely published. And so I know for AWS and for GCP, I'm not quite sure for Azure, but there was a 4K max post size that their WAFs would inspect. So if I just pad my request with something to get me over that 4K line, it doesn't get looked at by the WAF, right? And I used to work for a cloud provider. From a cloud provider's perspective, you can't have infinite hardware to look at these things. You have to sort of draw lines for stability of your infrastructure. But as an end user, you might think, oh, I turned on the AWS or the GCP WAF. I've got WAF rules. I even wrote a rule to say don't let this naughty traffic happen. But if I just pad that as an attacker with a little bit of extra data, then boom. And I've seen cases of this on the extreme where there was one that was an XML-based API that I was testing that I quite honestly injected 32 megs of space, which is ridiculous. It is an absolutely ridiculous request, but guess what? The API took it in and then crashed. So as an attacker, I win, and then your API loses. So I think there's some, if nothing else, that's fixed by basic rate limiting, right? Like post size, the max post size. This is something you can do at a very simple level, either at an API gateway, at a firewall, in Nginx. If you have your API fronted by Nginx, Nginx can do that for you. So there are some really basic configuration and sort of hardening you can do to drop a lot of this less easy to find and less sophisticated attacks. And when I think about attacking APIs, I sort of like to look at them at two different levels. I like to think of them at a data level, like can I change out data within a normal API call to get whatever my goal is as an attacker, right? Can I put in in a cross-site scripting injection, have it eaten up by the API and then parsed out somewhere else and pop, I've got XML. I've seen that before, right? Where the API doesn't get hurt by its bad data, but a downstream system that consumes it then suddenly gets hurt. And then the other side of it is what I call structural, right? There are certain ways that the data that's being submitted to an API it expects to get, right? But if I put 3 of the same data element in an API call and send it on, how does the API react to that? Does it take the first? Does it take the last? Does it try to take all 3? Does it concatenate them together? Right? You get all kinds of weird behavior based on the framework of the API, or even a more fun one when I was testing OpenStack was to send a request in XML and ask for the response in JSON, which is an absolutely insane way to talk to an API, but it was valid in OpenStack. And that was a code path that didn't get tested. There was no unit test for it because people assumed if you're wanting XML, we're going to give you XML. If you want JSON, I'm going to give you JSON. But I wasn't constrained by that. So doing these sort of structural tests can bypass a lot of the frameworks because from a intervening device, I'm sending JSON in and asking for XML. That's a normal header for what I want as my response. All that looks fine, but I was breaking APIs with those kind of funny games. Like doing the unexpected has been highly productive when I've tested APIs in the past.
I think it's hard for security testers because they don't necessarily have the context that they need to be looking for that kind of because really very often it comes down to specific bugs to an API, right? That are specific for that. And if you don't have the context of what's behind the scene, you're not necessarily looking, you don't know what necessarily you're looking for. And we had a customer case where, there was an API that had been created, and it was basically a JSON wrapper to, an old school XML API, similar story to what Matt, you were saying. And basically what they had found is that there was an access control rule that was being enforced, but if you call that new API, but you posted application or XML content on the way in and somehow bypassed that because the way that had been implemented assumed that you were coming in from a specific path, right? So you need to know a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes to be looking for that kind of stuff. But yeah, it is hard for testers.
Yeah, and as an attacker, I've had the opposite case where I had a pen test that was scoped only to this one API. I had no other systems in scope, just 443 to this one set of endpoints. So I sent a whole bunch of data to it, and I never could tell. Right? I mean, yes, I could put a script tag in for a phone number, let's say, and it would 200 back to me. Is that a finding? I don't know. I really don't think phone numbers have greater than and less than symbols in them ever. And the words for script. So it's certainly not doing its validation right. But since I couldn't see those backend systems, it was a black box to me as a tester. So I wrote a whole bunch of findings of, geez, this is really spooky, but I can't tell you if it's actually vulnerable, right? Because as a tester, it doesn't feel right, but I can't do anything with it. But Lord knows what happened to the backend systems behind that API tested, because I threw tons of trash into that thing, and it just 200'd all day long.
Yeah, I think the world of REST kind of changed us as well, right? I mean, I came into the API space just as web services and SOAP was becoming the thing. And it was, so frustrating, right? You would, as someone that was trying to protect a SOAP service or help them protect a SOAP service, like you just needed, even before you put WS security, whatever on top, just getting the call right was a nightmare. And, obviously you have the schema, but understanding that. So it was so strict and so hard to do those things, but the errors, and it protected a lot of things. Now we've gone to the world of REST, and we're getting there, I think, with some of the more defined, open API specs and that kind of stuff. But there are so many things that don't naturally get adhered to because of how open the world of APIs is. And Francois and I have been doing some work recently on Graph, GraphQL. And I can see some similarities with SOAP and GraphQL that I think maybe can help us, or help the API world have more security in there. But then, not having any security built into GraphQL for the other thing, the things you described, I think can be helped with GraphQL, but then some of the other parts are just completely forgotten about in that standard. So, I don't want to go back to the world of SOAP, but I am kind of a rules guy, right? And I love the fact of how regimented and it was how it was implemented. But yeah, I think the world has moved on, and that's probably introduced a whole load of security issues that will keep us busy for a long time.
Yeah, what I would concur, and then tying into what Matt said before about traditional security measures. Not to give a true plug, but to give a shout out to Alyssa Knight. She's one of those researchers who actually not only talks the talk but walks the walk. She actually downloaded 32 financial services apps, things that you would have on your phone to talk to your financial services company, whatever that happens to be, and that 31 of 32 had massive security gaps. And you would think that would be the one industry that would really have this locked down pretty well. So I totally agree with you, Matt. So this next one is for starting with Matt and Carl. We've been talking about API security, and I suspect the people who are listening today are thinking about apps and APIs that are being developed and being deployed in the cloud, which is a totally legit assumption. There's no question about that in today's world. But again, starting with Matt and Carl, what are you guys seeing in regards to on-premises? Are organizations developing and delivering apps on premises? And if so, what and how does that change any part of the equation from a management or security perspective?
I can jump in. Well, I definitely have seen on-prem. There's a mix. What was the latest number I remember reading was 48% of companies had half or more of their workloads on cloud. So there's a good chunk of people that are moving to the cloud, but that also means there's a good chunk of people that are still doing, more traditional data center things. I think one of the things that you buy by not being in cloud is you own all of the infrastructure, right? One of the things you get is that shared responsibility model if you're in cloud, and the pipes are open and handled by your cloud provider. The networking is handled by your cloud provider. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's handled by your cloud provider that you now own, and those same restrictions apply to APIs. The other thing is expertise, right? Do you have the expertise to run those systems at scale internally, which is always an interesting thing. It's hard to hire good IT people generally, and even more interesting when you start to do things at more of the cutting edge of the world. And then finally, do you have in-house expertise enough to do that kind of API testing? I think that was what drove a lot of what I was talking about earlier about how people were using DAST, traditional web app DAST testing with maybe feeded an open API spec to test a web app and assume they're testing their API. That's the the way they knew how to solve that problem. It's not really knocking those cybersecurity teams. That's just the tools they had and the process they knew. And so do you have people in place who understand API specific issues enough to be able to work on-prem and get that stuff done?
I don't think the protective measures and APIs really change in any sort of consequential way, because we do have, we see organizations that have an on-prem data center that have sophisticated new microservices applications that are API centric. That is not limited to a cloud-based hosted application. We see that on-prem a lot. So I think the other part is that there is to the extent that there's a journey for any organization to public cloud, it's pretty rare that organizations of size have completed that journey. There aren't too many companies at this point of scale, global scale, that are at 100%. And so, I think we aspire as much as possible to apply the controls agnostic to hosting environment, and that's really important, because even 5 years from now, we're still going to have organizations that are significant with significant dependencies on APIs. They're still going to be the data center, and so we have to instrument accordingly.
Yeah, that's a good point, because
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I talked to a friend of mine who works for a large company who is a more recent company, and they have Kubernetes and they have microservices, and he was telling me one of their products was composed of, I think it was 7K microservices, which just like, God bless them, like managing the complexity of that thing. And this is all on-prem, right? So this is somebody who has decided that even though Kubernetes has a lot of moving parts and it's very interesting to get correct, they had the expertise in-house to make it happen, and they preferred that over cloud, right? So you're right, like the controls aren't different. It's sort of just who owns them, right? Some of the controls you can hand up to a cloud provider if you're in cloud, which is not a bad thing, but you still have to, they still have to be managed.
Great, thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump down to the last one so we can do have some time left for Q&A. And this basically involves pulling out your crystal ball. So I'm going to start with what's on my screen going clockwise, so this will be a surprise to any of you if you're called on. For each of you, take a look at your crystal ball and tell us what you think or what you're seeing as emerging or future threats, whether they're security threats, whether they're web-based or otherwise. And I'm going to start with Francois, since you are immediately to the right of me.
Yeah, I think zero trust gives us some lessons about what to look out for, right? So I think that people should be treating every API, whether they today consider them to be private or public, treat them as public APIs, right? That's kind of like the lesson of zero trust. Assume secrets are compromised. And I think what's going to happen, we've talked a lot about measures that can be taken to improve API security. I think that the role that we are going to have to play, at layer 7, the API gateway, is make it easier for gateways to adapt to new security requirements, right? So make it more dynamic. Make it easier for something like a Noname to come and say, hey, we think we found something dynamic configuration change and automatically improve security, in a no-touch way. I think that's the future. That's kind of what we're shooting for.
Great, thank you. And next up is Aaron. And you're on mute again, so you just broke the tie.
You've at least two, Bill. I think what Carl touched on with microservices, or maybe it was Matt and Carl, you've got a whole mesh of microservices. You've decompiled your app and it's all over the place. Knowing the security and how that security model needs to be implemented across those microservices, I think is going to just become more and more important. I think there are some solutions out there now, but I don't think they're maybe what they should be. And I think, as organizations move more down that's definitely going to be an attack vector. And I think kind of leads into what I said, which is one hit on one API call is probably not your threat or your big threat. I think as organizations spread across several APIs supporting their mobile app or their website or their partners, the calls across those APIs are going to become the attack vector. And that kind of fits into the microservices world as well, because you make one call and then it hops around your microservices environment, making several different actions be performed. So yeah, that's kind of where I think we're going to see more and more of a need to protect those multiple calls.
Thank you. And then next up is Matt.
So far, everyone's had great answers, but I have one that's a little bit more down in the weeds. And this is based on a conversation I had with somebody who worked at GitHub, and this was very interesting to me. I'm trying to actually get them on the OWASP podcast, to be honest with you, because this was so interesting. But it used to be that a lot of APIs had, in essence, a login, right? I would send it a username and password, it would hand me a token, and then future requests would use that token to do whatever I needed to with the API. And GitHub found out that as they added security controls to their web app, where I could also pull this token, attackers just moved to the API, because browsers have a ton of built-in controls that help you as an app developer do things right. And those controls don't exist when I'm talking HTTP to an API endpoint. So after several rounds of GitHub turning on the making their login more secure and finding out that attacks just redoubled on their API, they took logging in through their API off the table. Now, if I want to pull a GitHub API token, I have to use my browser to go get it and then put it in my client. And you're seeing that more and more. I know GCP works that way. AWS certainly supports that way, if not only that way. And so I think we're going to see a lot of people removing that sort of human side of logging into an API go away and make it happen through a web app, because there are so many more security, controls at your beck and call if you're doing this through a web app versus doing it just directly through an HTTP request.
Great. And last is Carl.
Great question, Bill. So look ahead requires us also to look back. So if we go back 10 years, early days of the smartphone, and our first mobile banking applications had one or two data points like account balance that we could access when it first started. And now we log into a retail or a banking application. Now there's like 35 different services available to us, most of which are API enabled. Who amongst us thinks that consumers are not going to be asking for more ease of access to data, more integrated systems? And so the crystal ball is exponential growth in the use of APIs, which really creates, in my sense, the threat doesn't need to change, because the APIs are going to sort of quantitatively increase in utilization. Threat actors don't have to create novel things. We're just creating a new surface to be attacked, because we're satisfying user demand and consumer demand. So I think that, in the near term at least, it's really a game of pace and speed. So organizations that can capitalize on automation, automated testing, automated discovery, automating runtime analysis, they're going to have a natural advantage to the companies that don't, because the companies that can really capitalize and hone in on the use of automation and sort of an API control plane are going to be able to travel down that path and of quantity increase, adopting new API services with ease and with confidence. And so I think that that's what I see as this sort of exponential growth creates a space where there's groups of companies that are going to really thrive at capitalizing on the API economy, and then there's others that are going to get bogged down on it because they're still applying manual controls to what now is an API footprint that really can't be controlled with like manual processes.
Great. Thank you very much. With that, we're going to jump over to Q&A. We have just a few minutes left. If you do have questions, please enter them into the chat window. I'll start with one that's already out there. And this is across the board. Whoever has a good answer for this. Do you observe companies trying to introduce more and more self-service processes for gateways?
So I guess this is addressed to us. Oh, sorry, Matt, did you want to jump in?
No, please go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so I just want to say that I do, I do see some customers doing that, right? Customers that have the infrastructure set in such a way that they can have people self-service publish new APIs. I think that the more the infrastructure is set up to allow for that, the better. And by that, I mean, having templates that people can pick from, and things that are reusable to new APIs in a strict way. I think if you have that in place, it is possible, and we do see people adopt that model in certain cases.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I haven't seen that. I've seen that some. The other thing I've seen is that there's self-service of the security side of, and this is in much more progressive companies, but allowing a developer to run the test themselves, right? And I did this at Duo Security. We had a whole suite of tests that we ran every time something got checked into master. Those were a bunch of containers that knew how to run tests. I could easily give every developer those containers and say, run these containers before you check in. Yeah, right. And this is the gauntlet you're going to run in when you try to merge to master. Do it local, and then solve yourself the pain of having a broken merge and have to do all the hoo-ha to get that done. So yeah, I think progressive companies are doing that, because the developers want to get their code out, and if you make it easy for them to hop over those hurdles, they're going to do it.
Great.
I
Go ahead.
wonder whether the question is, we're seeing more self-service for API management. And by that, I mean for organizations that are treating their APIs as a product, and an API owner who maybe has no knowledge really of what the technology underneath is or what the security requirements are. And I think to Francois's point there, when people are treating APIs like that, it's absolutely vital that they get to self-service publish their API, but they don't get to choose the security. The security options are already there. This is security type A or security type B or security type C. They're not involved in that. And if you can publish APIs like that, you can actually reduce the attack vector, because each API that goes out there is always under rule A, B, or C, right? And then you can test from a security perspective. You can test more thoroughly because you've got less to test against. So I think self-service for APIs is definitely there. API gateways for our developers is a slightly different subject, but I think it's really important for the first one.
Great, thank you very much. With that, we are at the top of the hour. So what I'm going to suggest, first of all, is if you want to review this presentation, it will be available either late this afternoon or tomorrow morning on API Academy, and I will be sending out social on that. I do want to extend thanks out to not just Francois and Aaron, but also to Matt and Carl for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us on this event for API security. And look forward to July for our next Tech Talk. It'll be mid to late July, usually third or fourth Thursday, depending on what the holiday schedule is that time of year. So thank you again. I appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next Tech Talk. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.